All right, thanks, Ben. So the network is entirely based off of this, what we call the NDF, the network definition file. Contains all of the initial data that you need to connect to the network, which includes the public key of the permissioning server and information for connecting to at least one node. And it also includes like group parameters for end-to-end and CMIX encryption. It's a JSON file. Let's talk about the connection lifecycle. So as Ben talked about, you can discover users through the user discovery, but we really prefer the out of band because we're trying to go out of our way to make it so that we don't know who's talking on the system, much less what is being said. So it's going to be an interesting world in that we don't necessarily know even who is using it versus what is trending, right? So it's a very different world than what we live in right now. That is represented as a contact object, which can be encoded in like a QR code, or in our case, we use JSON files. The general setup is you request an authenticated channel to the partner that you have the JSON code for, or the contact code for, and then you establish that E2E relationship, and then you can start sending messages to each other. So the contact file, again, we're using JSON right now. It's pretty easy to encode this to any kind of QR code or an NFC, near field communication where you tap your phones together or something like that. It's the minimum amount of information necessary to create an end-to-end link. There's options for proving your ownership, and there's options for saying this user owns this email, this user owns this phone number, things like that. Yeah, it's got one public key inside of it, and it's got a byte array of an ID for the user so that you can address them on the CMIX network. So to send a message, you use this using the command line tool. As Ben said, it's extremely unwieldy. That's kind of by design. We're not expecting people to be using a command line tool to be actually sending messages and using it for day-to-day operations. It's more for an integration test. You can send a password for the secure storage. You give it the NDF file. You give it a log file. You give it a directory for the session, and then you give it a destination for who to send to. And again, we're using the user contact JSON files, and then you can send the message. And then the second line here is just showing the user 2 version of that, sending back to user 1. To generate your ID, you have to run it once. Sending the message to yourself is optional, but it's generally speaking, I think it's a good idea just to make sure the network is working. So by default, this will create a user contact.json file, and it will send an unencrypted message. And what that means is when it gets through CMIX, it's unencrypted. The sender is not known, but the receiver and what is said is known. Next slide. So sending unsafe messages, all we did here is, user 1 is now using the user 2 contact JSON to send the message, and user 2 is using the user 1 contact JSON to send the message. And we've kind of highlighted that to make it a little easier to understand what's going on. And to create authenticated channels, this is the world that we want to live in. And what I mean by that is there's a bunch of stuff that happens under the hood where channel creation is somewhat automatic. In an ideal world, both sides would get prompted. You'd both have to say yes. What we've done instead is created in the command line interface only an auto acceptor set of code path. And that's what the unsafe channel creation is doing. So what this does is it runs 2 clients at the same time. They both establish a connection to each other, and then they send messages to each other. Next slide. And this is the longer form version of what I just talked about. So to start, you send an authenticated channel request. This prompts you and says, are you sure you really want to make an authenticated channel with user 2? On the second command there, we've sent the message. You have to run these in sequence. And it says, yes, I accept the channel specifically from user 1. You have to give it a contact information to accept the channel. If you don't do that, a log message will appear that says, hey, you received this request from this user. Please rerun it to accept the request. And here's how you sort of complete the process. You send the message from user 2 to user 1. Then from user 1 to user 2. And then user 2 sends a message back and user 1 receives it. And because it tries to receive one message by default, we have that receive count set to 0 on the first one, and then set to 1 on the last one, just to kind of show you that it's sort of a back and forth type process that happens in sequence on the network. We have a little bit of a demo. We don't have another slide, do we? Can you check for me, Will? Yeah, so we have a little bit of a demo, which I will show you right now, which is using a lot of these concepts. Share now. And on the right-hand side here, I'm going to be watching log files. And on the left-hand side here, I'm going to be running an integration script that we created, which is going to show you all the commands it's running after it sets up a network on my own laptop. This is quite slow because it's running on a single laptop and it's running 5 servers.